Great. Well, why don't we start? As I said, I'm Stefan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program, and we have a weekly webinar during the time of COVID. It meets every Monday afternoon at 4. So please feel free to join us. Let me just walk through some of the upcoming events that we have. Next week, we'll have Aram Her, who's an assistant professor at the University of Missouri. She's going to be talking about some very interesting work she's been doing surveying North Korean refugees in South Korea about their views of politics, democracy, civic integration. The week after that, Jung Sung Yu, a former colleague here from GPS, has been doing some very interesting research on inequality in South Korea, and he'll talk about that work. On November 9th, we're going to have a panel on the North Korean economy with Byung-Young Kim, who's written probably one of the best books, or the best book, on the North Korean economy, and Bill Brown at the Korea Economic Institute. And then on November 16th, we're going to have a panel on purges in communist systems with Zui Tren here, a PhD from here, and who's currently at the Princeton Niehaus Center, and Edward Goldring, USC. And we'll be joined by Victor Shu, and we'll be talking about the dynamics of purges and promotions in state socialist systems more generally. I'm really pleased to introduce this topic because there's probably no one else in the country who knows as much about it as Sam Wilson. Sam is a policy analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. And for those of you who are thinking about doing this kind of security-related analysis, Sam reminded me that he actually doesn't have a technical background in space and missile issues, but he has a policy background in it and has written some things on Japanese space policy in particular, but he follows the Korean situation as well. And so we thought we would see this as an effort to look at the space issue in Northeast Asia more generally. Sam, do you want to talk for 20 minutes? If I have clarifying questions, I'll jump in. We're a fairly small group, so we should be able to have a pretty good conversation. We have about almost 20 on the call.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Steph. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, feel free to interrupt. I was trying to put in the Q&A or the chat my email address in case folks want to reach out afterwards. It's closed, but I'll make sure to get that in somehow so that, you know, after the topic, after the conversation, if folks want to reach out, they certainly can.
That's great. And we can get that to them if they contact us as well. So
perfect. So thanks, Steph, for inviting me. Thanks to Curtis, Amy, the team for setting this up. So my plan today is to do sort of a broad tour of space security issues and organically get to Japan, South Korea, and China. And I'll leave the majority of the time for Q&A, but again, feel free to interrupt if there's anything that you want clarification on. So with that, as you all may appreciate, space is hot right now. Space is changing dramatically with lots of new activity. And part of the reason for why is the financial costs and technical barriers for operating in space have never been lower. And two important reasons for this are, one, investments in capital. It seems as if every billionaire has a space company. And two, advances in technology. Curtis, would you put up the first slide? So I suspect that some of you may have watched the SpaceX launch in May. That was the first time that a commercial rocket sent astronauts to the International Space Station. But another thing that was remarkable is that they landed their rocket, which SpaceX will now reuse. This is a big change from the past. It used to be that rockets were used for one time, which is like the cost equivalent of using a 747 for one flight. So this is a big advance. Another change that has lowered the cost of launch is the miniaturization of space systems. Whereas in the past, satellites were always large and custom made. Now they're increasingly getting smaller and being mass produced on assembly lines. Here's an example of kind of the spread of satellite sizes. the James Webb satellites. Oh, sorry, would you go back to the current slide? Yeah. So the James Webb satellite, which is on my left, that's how everyone's reading it, right? The big one's on the left, right? So that's the size of 2 tennis courts. And now satellites are frequently the size of your microwave. These ones on the right are particularly small. They're called CubeSats. And national security satellites aren't as big always as James Webb, but they're still massive, the size of rooms. So this is a big change. Now satellites are cheaper, and dozens can fit on a single rocket. Okay, Curtis, would you go to the next slide, please? So this new environment is creating a democratization in space, allowing new players to participate. This includes new companies that are proposing large constellations of satellites that if realized, would transform the scale of activity we've grown accustomed to in space. So just as an example, SpaceX, for its Starlink constellation, has proposed putting up more than 40,000 satellites in orbit. For context, as you can see in this bar chart, the number of active satellites currently in orbit is about 3,000, and the number 15 years ago was as few as 800. So 40,000 would be a pretty significant jump. And the new space players are not limited to private companies. As of 2019, as you can see here, over 60 countries have a national space budget, over 70 countries own or operate satellites in orbit, and 9 countries plus the European Space Agency, which represents about 22 nations, can independently launch into orbit. Curtis, would you go to the next slide, please? So this surge in space activity and democratization in space has created a lot of value, including for security-focused students interested in North Korea, which I assume some of you are. Some of you may have even seen satellite imagery of North Korean nuclear and missile launch facilities. That's pretty unique, right? That type of imagery used to be reserved to major governments who typically classified it. Now, private companies have launched large constellations of remote sensing satellites that can capture pictures of specific locations on the Earth multiple times per day. So if you're interested in nonproliferation, you can be outside of government and use commercial satellite imagery to identify weapon sites, track maritime activity, and monitor missile movements. Along these lines, in 2019, major news outlets used commercial satellite imagery as the primary source for reporting on nuclear missile activity in North Korea, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And these private capabilities are getting more sophisticated. Companies have developed SAR satellites, which are synthetic aperture radar, which can capture imagery through all weather conditions. It can penetrate clouds at day and at night. And then some companies are beginning to launch satellites with hyperspectral sensors, technology that can theoretically identify chemical composition from space. And these services also, yes, stay on the side, please. And these services also benefit government. US defense and intelligence agencies have contracts in place with many private satellite companies to leverage their data and imagery. So this picture is of the Pentagon from the US Corona reconnaissance satellite program, which isn't necessarily super pertinent to the point I'm making, but it's a really cool image from the very first US reconnaissance satellite that I like a lot. And it gives you a sense of what satellite imagery used to look like. Okay, so from a national security perspective, this surge in remote sensing satellites is an example of the democratization of space that presents opportunities, but also risks, right? These capabilities create more transparency on the ground, which means that there's more to see, but it's also harder to hide, right? So like your military forces, if you have an airframe that you don't want a potential adversary seeing, that becomes harder. And this increasing transparency, which I think is a really big development in how space has changed, is true not just on the ground, but also in space. Next slide, please. So critical US national security satellites have historically been protected by their obscurity in high orbit. Adversaries could not track these satellites, nor did they have the means to strike them. That seems to be changing. There are now many more companies and countries that are developing capabilities such as radars and telescopes to help map out the space operational environment. And these capabilities are really important, right? Because there's going to be increased activity in space, there is more likelihood of a collision in space between objects, which could have disastrous consequences for the space domain. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock or George Clooney, but the movie is all about the dangers of debris, although it's extremely exaggerated and unrealistic. But if I had the copyright for it, I would have shown here George Clooney being attacked by space debris. But alas, I do not. So from a national security perspective, increasing transparency in space is good, but it also complicates the threat environment because now potential adversaries are able to see more of our assets. And this brings me to China. Next slide, please.
Sam, could I just interrupt
please.
and just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So one of the things that's implicit in your talk, but I'd like to make it explicit, is what might be called the privatization of space as well, right?
Correct.
Because
yeah.
in addition to the fact that you've got more satellites, you now have more private actors involved in this activity. So is my sense correct that the space domain used to be dominated by national government programs, probably with a high emphasis on telecom and military, but now you're getting this proliferation of private actors, and they can sell this information to anyone that they choose to sell it to, correct?
Right, that's absolutely right. So I mean, in the past, it used to be, the Soviet Union and Russia and US government programs. And now it's much more private activity, as well as there's much more activity from other countries, right? So it's not just the, I think there's two elements of the democratization of space. One is the number of countries that have government-owned assets, and then second, just being the number of commercial assets that are now doing things that was really kind of unthinkable, because those activities were reserved for major government powers, right? So I mean, even Google Maps, like that idea of, or Google Imagery of your block, right? That sort of thing is new because of the proliferation of private sats.
Right.
So with China, China is developing and testing space weapons. U.S. senior officials have said that China is developing weapons for all orbits, including those of U.S. nuclear command and control satellites, which we obviously care a lot about. So with increasing transparency coupled with increasing threats, suddenly U.S. critical satellites are more at risk. I always think of a line from former Secretary of the Air Force Heather Wilson, who said about our satellite architecture, we built a glass house before the invention of stones. Well, now there are stones. And with China, the stones they're pursuing, as listed here, include everything from jamming, cyber attacks, direct descent of missiles, and orbital weapons, which are particularly in vogue in space security conversations. I won't say more about that now, but if folks are interested in orbital weapons, I'm happy to cover it more in the Q&A. And China has earned a reputation for being a malign actor in space. And Curtis, I want to now take control and show an animation for why. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so this is showing a Chinese ASAT test in 2007. So China launched a ground-launched ASAT test to blow up one of its defunct weather satellites in low Earth orbit. And this was a huge deal in space circles because it created all this debris. So this is the debris cloud. This tool that we're showing is trying to capture the clouds of debris. And this animation, which runs for the next minute, is showing what the debris clouds looked like for 2 days after that attack. So a lot of this debris, as you can see, is going toward the Earth. Much of it burned up in the atmosphere, but much of it still remains in orbit. So this was a really nefarious act in space. And I should point out too, I'm focused on the threat of China per the theme of today's talk, but Russia presents a lot of these same threats and capabilities, and I'm happy to talk about them if there's more interest. Okay, I'm gonna stop share, Curtis, and hand it back to you. So, with these new threats, there's now conversation in U.S. space security circles about how do we respond, right? How do we defend our capabilities? How do we defend our systems? And one approach that has gained a lot of traction recently and a lot of focus is the idea of adding resiliency to our systems through international defense-based partnerships. Would you go to the next slide? Thanks. So the United States has defense agreements with countries that represent nearly a quarter of humanity, many of which are spacefaring nations. Many of the most mature space nations in the world are allies of the United States. The United States and its allies make up 11 of the top 15 countries with the biggest space budgets. And as you can see here, most of the satellites in orbit are owned and operated by the United States and its allies. Each icon here refers to about 10 satellites. So, through defense-based partnerships, the United States can leverage the capabilities and technology of partner nations and help integrate US and allied thinking on space security concepts. And these partnerships are important because they generate financial savings. Space operations are expensive, space capabilities are expensive. So sharing the financial burden can be mutually advantageous. These partnerships also can also help deter attacks, because now a system is not just a US capability, but an allied capability. So, this discussion of international defense-based partnerships brings me to South Korea and Japan. These are countries that are already among the most mature space nations in the world, with still lots of room for potential growth in space. I'll start with Japan, which I know more about. Next slide, please. Sorry, would you go back a slide? Yeah, perfect. So Japan has the 5th largest space budget in the world, the 4th most satellites in orbit. The country is one of 5 that has its own position, navigation, timing satellites, the creme de la creme of space capabilities. GPS, for example, is an example of a PNT system, position, navigation, timing system. And Japan is one of 6 countries, plus the European Space Agency, that can independently launch into higher orbits. South Korea is also in that club. Japan also has its own reconnaissance satellites and is developing its own defense satellite communication system and deep space radar. The US and Japan have a robust defense-based relationship. As one example, the Air Force is placing some of its sensor payloads on the next round of Japan's navigation satellites. So just to unpack that a bit, the payload is the part of the satellite that is doing something, transmitting information, receiving information, taking imagery, and you can have multiple payloads on a satellite. So in this case, a Japanese satellite will have its own payloads plus these US payloads, which may be unrelated to the broader mission of the satellite. This has been called hitchhiking, piggybacking. The takeaway is that this is a big deal. The launching of those satellites will be the first time that the US has put operational national security payloads on a foreign satellite and a foreign launcher. Notably, and this is one of the pieces I wrote about, or this is one of the pieces that Amy sent in the invite, is that Japan this summer proposed a new capability, missile warning satellites, which in its new space policy, Japan says it will study in cooperation with the United States. Japan acquiring its own early warning satellites would be significant. Currently, only the United States and Russia operate early warning satellite systems. The motivations here are interesting, right? Because in some respects, you might not expect a close ally to want to pursue a missile warning capability because we already have it, we share the data with them, and it's expensive and hard. There's definitely an element in Japan's leadership that that thinks they need their own independent capabilities. But I also think that there's a sense in Japan's leadership that thinks that the better capabilities they have, the more likelihood that they'll have better collaboration with the United States. So my sense is that it's not a significant pivot away from the United States. Japan has long been preoccupied with adversary missiles, and this just comports with that. Many of the country's prior space capability decisions have centered around missile threats. In 1998, it made the decision to develop its own reconnaissance satellites, partly in response to North Korean missile tests in the 90s. And then for many of the same reasons, in 2003, it made the decision to adopt its own ballistic missile defense system. And
Sam,
now,
Sam,
please.
I mean, this is really interesting, obviously, because it raises the question of whether this activity is integrated with ballistic missile defense capabilities, which Japan has in limited degree, and the United States has. But like, let's just take this individual case that you're talking about, where an American system is being put in space on a Japanese launch vehicle. Does that implicate Japan in any way in the transmission? I mean, it seems like Japan is implicated in the transmission of information which is coming from this project, right?
Yeah, I mean, so those payloads that are going to be on Japan's navigation satellites, which is those are sensor payloads. So those aren't part of those actually aren't going to be part of the early warning system. The early warning system that they're considering pursuing, I don't know, right? They just said that they're going to study it. It's striking to me that they would be studying it, but yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, to your point, they are, right? This becomes an allied capability if our payloads are on their satellite, right? And this is, there's this whole line of thinking about what is space deterrence, how do we deter in space, and you get these lines of thought like, well, if we have more allied capability, then an adversary will be less likely to want to initiate an attack. It's like the same rationale, I would say, is in the ground domain as like NATO's multinational forces in Latvia, Estonia, Poland. Those forces may not be able to prevent or defeat Russian military if the Russian military were to invade, but it is a signal that if you are to invade and attack these forces, it may not just be seen as an attack on Estonia, but in fact all the multinational forces that comprise that unit, right? So it creates, the idea is creating more cohesion, so that Russia would be less likely to initiate some sort of scary contingency in Estonia or Latvia. And I think that thinking, space deterrence is this this still sort of nascent thing, but people are one of the ideas is that allied capabilities can help allied capabilities can help prevent attack.
Great.
So would you go to the next slide, Curtis? So now we'll talk about South Korea. So last year I did a project for a government customer that was looking at countries that we should be focusing on, we should be prioritizing for future defense-based partnerships. And during that project, South Korea kept appearing at the top of the list, partly because it has a huge economy that is still undergoing high levels of growth, and it's a really technologically advanced country. As it is, South Korea is already a serious space nation. They have their own military communication satellites, their own Earth observation satellites, their own reconnaissance satellites. They have their own domestic rockets and their own satellite buses like the structure of the satellite. They have announced plans to develop their own navigation satellites as well, and more space situational awareness capabilities. Space situational awareness capabilities being the telescopes and the radars to map out the space operational environment. And these are two areas, navigation and space situational awareness, where they want to collaborate more with the United States. For space situational awareness, They have an agreement with US Space Command for both countries to share their data. And then as of the last few years, they have been participating in US hosted space situational awareness exercises like Global Sentinel, which is just shown here. So my sense is that in general, the security focused space partnership is still in its early stages, but it's growing. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for the US to engage more with South Korea in defense-based activity. So I spoke about space partnerships as one way to deal with counter space threats. Another way to deal with these threats that's relevant to this topic, to today's topic, is international diplomacy. Curtis, would you go to the next slide, please? So the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 still serves as the basis for international space law. Importantly, and this is in bold, it says that no country will deploy weapons of mass destruction in space. But we don't have much else to guide what capabilities or behaviors are acceptable. And here I'll circle back to China. Would you go to the next slide, Curtis, which is also my last slide? So Russia and China have proposed a series of UN resolutions, all of which have largely been the same, focused on prohibiting weapons deployed in space. These have had different names, the prevention of the placement of weapons in space, the initialism PPWT, the prevention of an arms race in outer space, PEROS, the no first placement of weapons in space. And these actually date back to Soviet proposals in the early 80s. And these have generated significant international support, as you can see in the numbers for the 2014 vote. The US has rejected these proposals. The US rationale has been that these proposals aren't serious. These proposals, by focusing on weapons in space, it ignores ground-based systems, which even today seem to represent the biggest threats to space capabilities. And moreover, any space-based system could be used as a weapon. As I mentioned, just colliding something into a satellite, right, could disable it. And if you think about debris, a 1 centimeter piece of debris, because it's traveling with such speed, it has the force of like a falling anvil, right? So so anything, if you put it in space, could be used as a weapon. The United States has wanted to shift the focus from prohibiting capabilities to prohibiting behaviors. What are the behaviors that are unacceptable in space? But the United States hasn't always offered an alternative, and they've been criticized for that. This seems to be changing a bit. Now there's a lot of focus in the US government on developing norms, declaratory policy, codes of conduct for what is acceptable in space. It is difficult to do this at the UN, so the United States will likely start these conversations with allies. And as important allies, Japan and South Korea, I think, will be crucial to that effort. So we'll see how that unfolds. But I would be surprised if there wasn't something in the works relatively soon. And just to end with a note about China, I think it's important to be sanguine at the end of a presentation. So I'll be a bit sanguine about China. Right now the United States receives significant asymmetric advantages from space, but China is starting to receive more and more benefits from space as well. And in my sense is space shouldn't be viewed as a zero-sum game. So I believe that once China gets more utility from space, it's going to have more incentive to protect it. And so I think, in the future, norms like preventing massive debris fields in space, which I think would be a valuable norm for everyone, will be less contentious in the future than it is now. I think there's going to be more room for agreement. So I will stop there.
Sam, this is just fascinating. We're already getting questions. So if anyone has any questions, please type them into the Q&A. And Enyar Zhu has a question. He writes, China completed the launching of its last satellite the Beidou navigation satellite system in June 2020, what do you think of the competition between Baidu and GPS, for example? Or what is the competitive space? Is this at the commercial level? I want to make sure I understand it.
No, that's a national capability. Position navigation timing is still being, because it's such a big investment, is still being largely just a government effort. So just for context, there are, let's see, I think there are 5, I'll count them out and know. Global navigation satellite systems. GPS was the first. Russia has one called GLONASS. The European Union has Galileo, and China has Beidou. So 4, actually. And then there are regional position navigation timing systems. So Japan has one called QZSS, and India has one as well, and South Korea is proposing developing its own. So yeah, I don't think too much about I don't think it's problematic in terms of competition. I do think that it is worrying to some people in the United States that if China has Beidou, then it may be more likely to see GPS as a viable threat in a conflict, right? And because it's not relying on GPS, because it has its own navigation system, But I mean, these capabilities are benefiting everyone. I mean, something you may not know is, my iPhone. If I'm getting better signals from a Russian navigation satellite, my iPhone will use the Russian navigation satellite signals, right? So, there's something to be said that, all these capabilities are providing some benefit, but, I think the real concern with Beidou is just that, now if they're not relying on GPS, could GPS be seen as a target in a conflict?
Right. Becky, do you have a question? Do you want to jump in?
I did have a question, actually. I was wondering if there's any sort of sense of North Koreans' capabilities in this field, or if they have any, or if China's assisting them at all.
Yeah, North Korea is one of those 9 countries that can independently launch into orbit. I think, and that's reported by DoD. It's hard to really get a clear sense of what's true about North Korean capabilities, but there's a huge convergence between missile, like a rocket, and a rocket can be a space launch vehicle or it can be a missile, right? So North Korea focusing on its missiles is going to give it more rocket capabilities, more space launch vehicle capabilities. So it shouldn't be surprising that they have an independent ability to launch, but I just see the open source stuff about North Korea, and I can't really tell. And in terms of cooperation with China, I really can't speak to that, but I'm happy to reach out to a specialist and get back to you.
Well, we do know, we're able to track the actual satellite launches, of course.
Right.
And I think there's only one North Korean satellite that's still in orbit, and I think that it lost transmission shortly after it went into orbit. So I think their question would be, in part, if they were to launch again, which would be seen as very provocative because of the carryover to missile capabilities, then they could potentially put something else up. Yeah. But Becky's could also be asking a somewhat different question, which is, are the Chinese sharing anything with the North Koreans or something like that? Which of course we wouldn't know, though I would personally doubt it.
Yeah, and there's some reports of North Korea focused on counterspace capabilities too, particularly kind of at that lower end of reversible effects, like cyber or electronic attacks, jamming. So there seems to be an area of interest for North Korea. We don't necessarily see anything super sophisticated though. But again, they have demonstrated the ability to independently launch to orbit, which is not something that many countries can do.
Sam, if I can ask you to back up a little bit for us people who are not space junkies, and kind of define for us the population, so to speak, of what's up there. Because you've mentioned a variety of different types of satellite capabilities, you know, from high orbit things, which go all the way to nuclear command and control, down to smaller systems that are being launched on a small budget for more narrow commercial purposes. But I'm having a hard time figuring out, you know, kind of what the terrain up there is, you know, and then you've got stuff that's really related to telecom, and then you've got stuff that's related to space imaging. Is there a typology or a kind of map of the type of things that are up there? Because it's hard, I think, for people who don't follow this to get a sense of what's flying around up there.
Yeah. So I would say there are most satellites fall in 4 categories. One being remote sensing or Earth observation. And, you know, by that, I mean, you know, imagery, even sort of electronic surveillance. And then the second category, I would say, is weather satellites. So, and those are mostly government capabilities. And so, oh yeah, so, and you also asked about where they are. So traditionally, remote sensing satellites were in high orbit, but now, because those satellites, to get them to such a high orbit, are expensive, now people are starting to invest in cheaper satellites in low orbits. So, you know, you could have, you know, if you have something in geostationary orbit, which is really high, right, like 12 miles up, you can look at a certain place on Earth and you can have it there at all times, right? So you can see how that could be advantageous, right? If there's a particular place where you're interested in, you could put up a geostationary satellite and see it. But now there are, you know, there's a lot of interest in satellites with what are called like high revisit rates that are being able to track, you know, much more breadth, but also with a lot of frequency. And so now there's like a company called Planet, which has 150 satellite constellation in low Earth orbit, and that's able to capture a picture of the Earth each day. So and sometimes for some places several times a day. So remote sensing satellites can be in high orbit or in low orbit. So weather satellites are usually in high orbit as well, and then kind of a polar orbit, which is giving you a lot of good data about for models that are feeding into predicting weather patterns. Then there's position navigation timing would be my third category. And position navigation timing satellites are all in medium Earth orbit. So when I say high orbit, low orbit, this is the medium area. And that's just because of why, and you know, these satellites this is like the best place for position navigation timing satellites, not based on threats, just based on where, you know, on their location, which is really optimal for.
And this is GPS and Baidu, right?
GPS, yeah,
right.
Baidu,
right.
GLONASS, like Russia's system.
Right.
And then the fourth category would be communication satellites, which are the bulk of satellite capabilities. And now the real push that we're seeing are large constellations of communication satellites in low Earth orbit. And of course, there are communication satellites in high orbit, right? So some like US nuclear command and control satellites, which are doing a lot of communications, those are in high orbit. But now you're seeing like SpaceX for its Starlink constellation, Intelsat, you know, a lot of these companies are focused on cheap satellites in low orbit.
Yeah. Well, you've got someone already asking what your Twitter handle is, Sam. So you've had success. Let me read another question. I'm wondering if there exists potential possibility that, I guess this is the same question, would launch, I mean, this is really asking about missile capabilities as opposed to satellites, but I don't know if you have a take on this about what North Korean missile capabilities are. That's a little separate topic, but.
Yeah. No, I'm actually happy to talk about that. North Korea. So I'm working on. We just had a missile paper come out that was kind of arguing for a new taxonomy based on what missile capabilities actually are, and I'm completing a project on kind of the U.S. hypersonic missile debate. And one thing that I think gets lost when we think about missile capabilities and missile systems, and I think this especially true in sort of circles talking about hypersonic missiles, is that it's usually framed, if you read press reports about hypersonic missiles, it's usually gliders can maneuver and can lead to different trajectories, which is different than conventional missiles, ballistic missiles, ICBMs, what have you. And the truth is that most missiles actually aren't just quote unquote ballistic, and by relying on initial propulsion, and that includes North Korean systems. North Korea does have some traditional ballistic systems, but they also have systems with payloads that can maneuver aerodynamically. So we need to stop thinking that I think that a lot of the attention on hypersonic gliders or hypersonic cruise missiles seems to understate what the capabilities are of the broader missile environment, and that includes systems like North Korean and Iranian systems, which have maneuverable, aerodynamically maneuverable payloads.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sam, did you have anything you wanted to ask? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, actually, I did have a question I wanted to ask. You had mentioned that private companies were, like SpaceX, for example, were having these like mega constellations of small satellites for like communications. And of course, that can be an issue because of private companies. If a lot of private companies start doing this, there's going to be too much congestion. And so my question is, do you think that that is more of a concern right now for space, or do you think that the idea of countries trying to push for like militarization capabilities should be more of a concern right now?
Yeah, great question. So I'll take the second question first. The initial capabilities in space have all been military, right? It's all been military funded. So I think there's a distinction. Space has been militarized forever. Space, a lot of the debate right now is about the weaponization of space. When I was talking about those UN resolutions, it's like the weaponization of space. Why Russia and China wants to prevent weapons, or they at least are proposing UN resolutions to eliminate weapons in space. But that's not to say that it's not that space isn't militarized, right? And then what's the bigger challenge? Congestion. We have really great experts about space traffic management and debris anticipation. There was actually just like a week ago, Leo Labs, which is a private company that does space situational awareness, was saying that I actually think there's a high level of risk for a collision between these objects, and then they talked to one of our experts, and he was like, yeah, I don't see it as such a big risk. We see it as like 1 out of 250 million, right? So these things are hard. Space, I know this will sound silly, but space is big, and space can accommodate these constellations, but it requires planning. It can't just be it can't just be we all put these things up and then we fail to account where they are. So I think we have pretty good technology, but it requires satellite operators and owners doing the right thing. If there is a collision risk, to reserve enough fuel on your satellite to move it, what's called a maneuver, and as well as to put your satellite, to make sure that your satellite after it's no longer usable can go back into the atmosphere to burn up, right? Or into some orbit that's non-usable. So it requires responsible activity, but I don't think that the sheer number of systems we're talking about is going to has to lead to this worsening of the domain. I just think it requires responsible action. And then on the weaponization of space, I think again, it's a great question. I don't think, Russian Chinese proposals. I find the U.S. rationale pretty compelling, right? That these proposals are partly to make us look bad. I actually think they're partly about, this is going to be off topic, but I think they're partly about the fear that we're going to develop space-based intercepts. If you look back at when the Soviet Union first proposed this, it was like when
Star Wars.
Yeah, it was when people were talking about Star Wars. It was actually before President Reagan unveiled it, but it was when people were talking about it. And I did a track 2 in Moscow last December, and it was ostensibly about space security, but everybody was just yelling at me about space-based intercepts. And I was like, what is going on? We don't have a space-based intercept program, but there's a line in the most recent missile defense review about the fact that we'll conduct a study looking at it or something, that the US government would conduct a study, and just everybody was terrified about it. And I think there's different debates about whether those fears are genuine, but I think there's something real going on if they've been proposing this thing at the UN for 40 years.
Right.
But yeah, great questions. Those are two of the big issues in space.
Right. Yeah. Sam, we have another question from M. Yao, and I'm just going to reformulate it slightly. He makes the point that the US, China, Russia, and the EU have mostly dominated this the space, so to speak. But the number of countries that you mentioned was extraordinarily large to me. And I want to make sure that I understand and others understand. When you talk about 60 or 70 countries, you're talking about the satellite, right? You're not talking about the launch capability.
Yeah, that's
so the
correct.
launch capability is limited to what, 10 or 15 countries, but they're putting up satellites for 60 or 70 countries, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So the number of countries that can independently launch was 9 plus the European Space Agency. So,
right.
But those countries, yeah, I mean, they have something in space. I mean, and I mean, getting something in space is becoming easier and easier too, right? So, when we talked about the miniaturization of space systems, the smaller you get something, the easier it is to get something into orbit, right? The problem is that when something's really big, it requires a lot of force to get it into orbit. And even before that, if you want to get something in high orbit, that requires much, much more force, right? So if you want to get something in low orbit that's small, it's becoming much, much easier.
Right. So Sam, let me, in our closing moments here, let me pivot this back to Northeast Asia, because some of the people who are on have a particular interest in Northeast Asia. And I have a question which is not very well formulated, so you're going to have to help me formulate it. But I'm trying to figure out how to think about the relationship between the ballistic missile defense capability that the United States has in the region and everything you've been talking about, in effect. And let me just cast the question from Beijing's perspective. So, Beijing has been worried that effectively what's happening is a loose network of ballistic missile defense capabilities are taking shape in Northeast Asia between the Koreans and the Japanese and the US. And does the discussion which you've had about these satellite capabilities, is that completely independent of that capability, or does it play into it as something which would, for example, facilitate the capacity to see things coming, which plays directly into defense from Beijing's perspective? I mean, if you can see me coming, then you're arguably degrading my strategic capability, right?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I would point to something we haven't talked about that's a big development in national security space is this new agency called the Space Development Agency. And the focus of the Space Development Agency is to develop a large constellation of systems in low Earth orbit. And they would be doing things like tracking missile tells, right? Tracking all tells, also having a kind of a battle management function that could be like orchestrating the the satellite constellations using AI, and it would have a missile warning capability, right? So, I think when you hear like these concepts like left of launch, which, countries like Russia and China are like, when they see that in, say, our missile defense review, that's pretty concerning to them. And then you pull that back, that's, if that were actualized, that's because of space capabilities. Space-based capabilities being able to see, be able to detect infrared signatures, space capabilities being able to see imagery and penetrate, using, say, synthetic aperture radar or hyperspectral systems to be able to find things that are hidden. All of that, I think, is part of what would be required for like a left of launch if you were to anticipate attack before before it happened.
And so just so everyone knows, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, the left of launch concept is the idea that you would have the capacity to take something out on the launch pad or on the TEL, the transporter erector launcher, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah. When I was doing when I was in Moscow, they were really concerned about that too. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, I mean, I said this earlier on, and we talked mostly about what space looks like, but I think something that is going to change the relationships. It's going to change the relationships we have when we think about security. Is how space is making everything much more transparent. I do think that's something we have to that's going to continue, and so it's something we should think about how that's going to affect strategic stability, how that's going to affect how these countries are going to react. How would Russia and China react if we developed a constellation of satellites that could do all these things, right? Like, I suspect they're not going to just say, okay, are they going to develop the same? Are they going to try to emulate it? Or are they going to try to focus more on counterspace capabilities to kind of nullify those advantages? Those are questions that I think are really intriguing, that are all in sort of the political science realm, not in the technology realm.
Well, I mean, I can tell you, I was just on a webinar the other day on a group of people who are watching North Korea in a variety of ways, including the use of satellite imagery, including Jenny Town, who runs 38 North, and Melissa Hannum, who used to be in Monterey. And one of the things that both of them noted is that the North Koreans are actually responding to this new capability by concealing things.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes as simple as just building sheds. You used to look at you used to be able to look at this thing, and now what you see is a shed, and you don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
So I mean, the North Koreans are clearly cognizant of the fact that people are watching them, and are thinking about potential vulnerabilities that arise from that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Someone has asked you about the slides. We've gotten lots of questions. Sam, this has really been terrific. Unless anyone in the webinar has another question that they want to pose on the Q&A, I think we're going to do what we usually do, which is try to break right at or a little before the hour. Sam, I just can't thank you enough for doing this. I mean, this is such a rich area. And anyone who's interested in the slides, are you willing to share the slides?
Yeah. I'm happy to do it.
Great. Just contact me, and you can send them to me. And then I'll also post up some of those other papers to people who are taking classes in this, so they can have access to it. Thanks very much, Sam, for doing this. We really appreciate it. It's a great seminar.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.